In this week's episode of Bleach the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Bazz-B confronts Haschwalth in a fight to the death. We discover the origins of the Sternritter from 1,000 years ago, and witness the journey of two young friends as it reaches a tragic end. Well, that was certainly something. In what feels like a sharp pivot from the more formulaic, battle-heavy episodes of the last month or so, the 1000-Year Blood War arc episode 38, Friend, at long last unravels the mysterious history of the Quincy's, and of the Wandenreich in general. While I'd have absolutely loved even more of a deep dive look into their past, what we got this week was some of the most visually striking and emotional work the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime has delivered so far. Kubo himself has noted in the past that the Friend saga is a particular favourite of his, though admittedly calling a single episode a saga doesn't feel like it quite works now. But I think the anime team knew that, poring over every detail meticulously and presenting what genuinely feels like a work of art at times. While the actual present-day battle between the two Sternritter takes a very necessary backseat to the hefty flashback itself, it in some ways offers up perhaps the most incredible parts of the episode. The ending in particular is both beautiful and gut-wrenching in all the best ways. Seriously, I could sit and gush about how startlingly good this episode looked, at least in my opinion, from start to finish, and it absolutely gets me hugely excited for what's still to come in the future. It's great and reassuring to think that really every single big tentpole moment yet to happen is likely guaranteed to have at least some baseline of high quality based on everything we've seen so far, and that's a fantastic prospect. Of course, it's great to see not just the story of Bazz-B and Haschwalth this week, but also of Yhwach as well. He plays an interesting role here. The major focus of the narrative absolutely isn't on him. Kubo wisely chose to stick to a more human story, yet Yhwach hangs over everything that takes place like a great looming shadow. So, as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1000-Year Blood War arc episode 38, Friend, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and yes, what it took away from the source material. However, before we get started on today's video, guys, if by the end of it you enjoyed this review and you want to see more from me and the channel, make sure to hit subscribe now, as it really does help me out and I do genuinely appreciate the support. And of course, I want to quickly say that I hope everyone had an amazing Christmas as well, and thank you so much for your well wishes, they really did mean an awful lot. And well, there's not too long to go now until the new year is upon us. But enough of that, let's get going with the review. So as always, we'll start by taking a look at what chapters are covered in this week's episode. After diverging from the path set by the source material early into the Varvelt arc, we've now doubled back around and found ourselves at last at the foot of the much anticipated Friend saga flashback, featuring the backstory of Bazz-B and Haschwalth. As expected, everything to do with poor old Mario Quincy has indeed been cut, and the episode instead gets us straight into the action. There's also absolutely no sign of the Bambis this week either, so I imagine we'll see them as early as the start of episode 39. But without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 38. Firstly, we have chapter 630, The Twinned Twilight. Then chapter 631, Friend, the title of this week's episode. Chapter 632, Friend 2. Chapter 633, Friend 3. And yes, you guessed it, chapter 634, titled Friend 4. This is an interesting episode from a structure perspective. Despite only really covering 4 1/4 chapters, it feels absolutely jam-packed. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The Friend flashback is made up of 4 fairly dense chapters with a lot of dialogue, at least by Bleach standards. The action is mostly kept to a minimum, and the battle in the present day is really only used to facilitate the furthering of the flashback itself. As a result, the episode is one of the longest in the series to date, clocking in at almost 26 minutes total runtime. Before we knew that we were getting an extra episode in this core, many of us thought that the Friend saga would make up the finale, perhaps as a two-parter itself, but having actually watched the episode now, I definitely think that would have been a stretch. From as far as I can tell, absolutely nothing is removed from the Friend flashback here in the episode, and on top of that, there are some new scenes included here too. So, Friend is already lean and efficiently told in a fairly short amount of space here in the manga. Adding enough extra content to have reached 2 full episodes worth would have been asking a lot in retrospect. Anyway, let's move on to the spoiler analysis itself as we take a deeper look at episode 38, titled Friend. The episode opens with chapter 631 as a young boy lifts his wooden bow and arrow. Dark bruises are already visible on his arms here, and the makeshift weapon is a symbol of his inability to gather reishi. Under the warming glow of the late afternoon sun, with the lordly black family castle cresting the emerald treetops behind him, a young Yhwach Haschwalth attempts to snag himself a rabbit, but fails, missing with his arrow. This little sequence of Haschwalth actually drawing his bow is new here, as the chapter started with his arrow sailing through the air. Before we move on though, I want to discuss the way this episode doesn't start. Now, I just mentioned a moment ago how packed this episode actually is. Squeezing all of Friend into this one episode was likely a pretty tall order, so it makes sense that this is all we focus on this week. However, it's definitely a little weird that there is zero continuation of the Kyoraku battle whatsoever this week. For those who have no knowledge of the manga at all, I feel like it must be a bit jarring to go from the dispersal of Leel's power to immediately finding themselves 1,000 years into the past, with really no bridge at all, so to speak, only to likely return to Leel's defeat in a future episode, unless the anime team really has cut that scene completely, but I'd be surprised. Anyway, having failed again, Haschwalth watches as an actual Quincy arrow zips past him, impaling the rabbit with ease. What's interesting here is that while we later learn it was Haschwalth's influence that powered Bazz-B up over the years, turning him into the extremely powerful fighter that he is today, it's clear from this scene, the moment the two of them meet, that Bazz-B was the more skilled of the two already to begin with. Anyway, standing atop a tall tree, a young Bazz-B, simply called Bazz here, demands that Haschwalth identify himself. Before we continue again, I think it's important to establish some context for this flashback. Remember that this flashback takes place over 1,000 years ago, but even more importantly than that, this is over 1,000 years ago in the human world. This is one of the oldest time periods we've ever seen in Bleach. The human world is almost unrecognisable from how it is today. These characters are clearly growing up in some part of Europe, I'd assume, during the Middle Ages, in a land where lords live in grand castles, while peasants and the common folk hunt the wildlife in order to survive. In my opinion, this is genuinely one of the coolest aspects of these characters, and it kind of blindsides the reader a bit, and yet nothing is done with it in the modern day. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to have even the slightest notion that both Haschwalth and Bazz-B were actually from the Middle Ages, which is a totally crazy and out-there concept. They both seem completely modern in almost every way, and it's a shame that this idea that much of Yhwach's empire is actually ancient, a skeleton, a relic from the past, isn't really expanded upon or even played with at all. Anyway, with Bazz having inadvertently revealed his own name first, Haschwalth introduces himself too as the opening begins to play. Already this episode looks stunning. The sense of ambiance is wonderful. It really feels like the two children are surrounded by a whimsical, fairy tale-like forest that could very well have leapt out of a painting or from the pages of a history book. The golden rays breaking through the leafy canopy, the untended vines creeping down enormous tree trunks. Save for the gigantic castle in the background, there's a true sense that this land is untouched by civilization, certainly as we know it. After the opening, we return to the cliffhanger ending of episode 36, which adapted the final segment of chapter 630. In the present day, after killing the Soldat, which by the way we've still had no update on their true nature, Bazz-B confronts Haschwalth within Varvelt itself. After Bazz-B guns the Soldat down, Haschwalth asks what he's doing. It is a slight shame, again, to see Mario Quincy gone, specifically because it would have been cool to include his extremely gory and creative death at the hands of Bazz-B's burner finger through the eye, but regardless, he responds to Haschwalth by snapping that really, Haschwalth should be asking how he's still alive. When Haschwalth doesn't respond, Bazz-B charges him with a wild, animalistic grin on his face. In the first of many extremely fluid and frankly lovely sequences, Bazz-B lashes out, grabbing Haschwalth by the collar before preparing a burner finger, his gloved fingertips simmering with a bright orange glow. But Haschwalth is quick to react, however, and he grabs Bazz-B by the wrist, flinging him downwards with pure physical strength, while leaping into the air at the same time, even somehow undoing his cloak and tossing it onto Bazz-B in one swift manoeuvre, attempting to blind him. But in another nice move, as Bazz-B whips the cloak from his face, Haschwalth forces it back by ramming the hilt of his sword into both the cloak and Bazz-B's head, knocking him away once more. Bazz-B isn't letting him get away that easily, however. Reaching out, Bazz-B grabs a hold of the hilt, burning through Haschwalth's cloak before aiming another burner finger directly at his enemy's face. The concentrated stream of fire incinerates the cloak and explodes outwards, sniping right through the back wall of the castle and out into the night sky. Pushing away from him, Haschwalth skids along the stone floor, collecting himself as the two face each other down in the wake of their initial confrontation. It's here that Haschwalth realises that Bazz-B's wounds haven't come from an enemy, but instead from Yhwach's Valen, and thus Bazz-B wasn't chosen. Bazz-B takes a stand, angrily telling Haschwalth that it wasn't just him. Every Quincy down below was struck by the Valen, leading them to all being wiped out. Again, this is a bit of a weird line to include in some respects. As far as the Sternritter specifically go, we know they weren't really wiped out. Bazz-B himself was literally struck by the light, as was Nanana, and ironically, Bazz-B is harping on about the unjust treatment of his fellow Quincy's when he himself put a bullet through Nanana's back mere hours ago. Interestingly, Bazz-B's actual description of what the Valen did is removed here, likely because it only further highlights the inconsistencies. In the manga, he states that those who hid lost their Volstendish, while those who were struck by the light had their lives stolen. Even though, as I said, both he and Nanana were directly hit by the column of light. And again, Robert's fate has weirdly been completely and utterly scrubbed from the anime. This would have been the ideal final opportunity to show him getting vaporized, but alas. Moving on, in response, Haschwalth coldly states that he's sorry to hear that, which Bazz-B calls him out on. And this is a cool character moment for Haschwalth in my opinion, because it shows how far he's strayed, how far he's actually fallen in a sense. In the wake of the episode, there's been a lot of totally justifiable discourse discussing how tragic Haschwalth's character is, and how brutally sad and difficult and crushing it must have been for him to kill Bazz-B here, and of course that's probably true, I'm not disputing that, but make no mistake, Haschwalth is not a good person with just some sad backstory. He, like his king, doesn't really care about any of the Sternritter whatsoever. For Haschwalth, Bazz-B is the only exception, and even then he murders him for Yhwach's cause, destroying the last remnant of his humanity. Haschwalth is completely complicit in the Valen, and sure, you could argue that he holds no sway over what Yhwach does at all, but it's pretty obvious he doesn't reject it either. Think about it, as far as he's concerned, Haschwalth has long left Bazz-B behind for the most part. The memento, the keepsake that is the black family button affixed to his sword, is a reminder of what once was, but it is little more than that. Haschwalth was more than happy to let Bazz-B die amongst the other Sternritter in the Armageddon if it meant Yhwach achieving his goal, because again, as far as he's concerned, he's left all that behind. His apology here to Bazz-B after being faced with the knowledge that they've essentially purged all of their supposed comrades is completely paper-thin and insincere, something Bazz-B notes immediately because, of course, Haschwalth already knew this happened. And to clarify, I love this. It makes Haschwalth way more interesting in my opinion than if he was some perpetually lovesick puppy pining after his past. Instead, he's got his keepsake, and that's really good enough for him. Now he's moved on and transformed into a cold and callous man, frankly unrecognisable to Bazz-B now. But of course in the end, Haschwalth does feel a sliver of regret for the path he chose, and makes a choice to help Uryu save his friends, even if he believes it's all for naught in the end. For the actual act of just trying, even if it amounts to nothing, is worth the risk. A choice he himself could never make. Anyway, we're getting way too far ahead of ourselves here. Bringing it back to the episode at hand, Bazz-B snarls that they've known each other for years before demanding Haschwalth call him Baz once again, like he used to do when they were younger. And again, this right here is Bazz-B determined to pull some of that old Jugo out of this unfamiliar statuesque, almost robotic figure that his friend has become. Unleashing Burnerfinger 2 in another little sequence that looks fantastic, Bazz-B whips the streaks of flame around himself, openly challenging Haschwalth. In response, Haschwalth unsheaths his sword. In a cool little detail, you can already glimpse the black family button attached to the hilt right here. Bazz-B then says it's almost time. As soon as Yhwach sleeps, he and Haschwalth will switch powers. It's funny, in the manga, Bazz-B glances out of the window and sees the sun setting, noting that it'll be night soon, but of course here in the anime it's just constantly dark here in Varvelt, so that line is removed. But with a determined look on his face, and both characters are drawn excellently here by the way, Bazz-B resolves to kill both Haschwalth and Yhwach's power all at once as the screen slowly fades away to reveal a young Bazz-B collapsed in front of his family's castle as it burns with a hellish blue flame. It's a fantastic visual, and I love the decision to make it blue. It's perfect, and of course ties back into the blue flame the Wandenreich use in the present day. But as chapter 631 begins, we're treated to another very slick little action sequence as Bazz-B rushes Haschwalth again, this time with Burnerfinger 2 active. Swiping at Haschwalth, Bazz-B misses as the Sternritter Grandmaster leaps over him before dodging a second attack that scorches a nearby wall. Somehow Haschwalth manages to run along the ceiling before twisting round to strike at Bazz-B, drawing his sword. Bazz-B himself turns and unleashes another Burnerfinger blast, which Haschwalth cuts through with his blade as the screen turns a blinding white. Again, not only is it really cool, but I mean all of this just looks awesome. For whatever reason, it's actually been slightly changed up from the manga here though. In the manga, Bazz-B draws his Reishi crossbow in this moment, but here in the anime he just uses Burnerfinger instead. Anyway, at this point we continue the flashback from where we left it at the start of the episode. Baz follows Jugo through the forest, pointing out that because Jugo is so pathetic and can't catch any food, he'll look out for him. Jugo admits that he can't make a Heilig Borgen like Baz can, but Baz retorts that he can only do so because he's a genius. Again, I do wish this time period was expanded on. It seems like Quincy's are just accepted openly within the world here. Either that, or this is a region full of Quincy's specifically. Did the humans of the Middle Ages know of Reishi, Hollows and the like? There are just so many unanswered questions. Anyway, Jugo asks Baz to not call him by that nickname, as he hates it. I guess Jugo is a common abbreviation of Ugram. I've honestly got no idea, but it's also the name by which Yugo's abusive uncle calls him, which is why he detests it so much. As Jugo instinctively clutches at his bruised arms in a moment of surprising tact, Baz seems to take notice without saying anything, and instead takes genuine pity on Jugo, tossing him the rabbit. This is the start of what would become their interesting and complex dynamic. Baz does seem to already care for Jugo in some form, in a very real and innocent way, yet he's already oblivious to the ways Jugo is truly hurting, disregarding his wants and continuing to do things his way, most obviously by continuing to call him Jugo right until the present day. It's as though he completely glossed over and ignored the very first request that Haschwalth had. There's a sense that already Bazz believes he knows best between the two of them, right down to what Jugo wants to be called, and Jugo is a very dependent person and immediately latches on to Bazz-B no matter what. The class divide found during this time period is hinted at nicely here too. Bazz remarks that he doesn't hunt so he can eat, he just hunts to show off. This is because, as the son of the region's lord, Bazz's family, his clan, are clearly very wealthy. He's likely never struggled for anything a day in his life. This immediately establishes a power dynamic between the two characters, and even a potential underlying reason for Jugo to feel some resentment at some point in the future. As Bazz tosses Jugo the fastener from his cape, emblazoned with the Black family insignia, he tells Jugo that from today he'll teach him everything he needs to know, and that together they'll become the strongest Quincy's around. In that instant, Jugo's previously dull eyes light up. Bazz, in his own rudimentary way, has offered Jugo a hand, a genuine connection, a place to feel valued and wanted. As we'll see, throughout the friend flashback, Jugo is a deeply troubled individual, suffering from terrible trauma, and that trauma manifests in ways that dictate his destiny. As Bazz returns to his castle, Jugo's brief moment of happiness is shattered by a swift return to the norm. His drunken, abusive uncle, whose name was revealed to be Yhwach, appears from within the trees, telling Jugo that he's in big trouble. In a really cool piece of imagery, we get that same shot of Jugo's wide eyes, except this time, they've instantly returned to being dull and lifeless, sapped of colour, dark bags forming beneath them. It's an effective reveal and one that works wonders at showing and not telling the viewer everything they need to know about Jugo's current situation. Back in the present day, Bazz-B muses that he thought he heard Haschwalth calling the castle Varvelt, when its name used to be Silburn. He asks Haschwalth when the name changed, but his former friend remains quiet this time. It's interesting to think that maybe Haschwalth doesn't believe that any of the Sternritter left behind perhaps have the right to call this castle Varvelt, or even know that that's really its name now. When Haschwalth eventually says that they should take their quarrel outside, as they'll continue to damage the castle otherwise, Bazz-B scoffs at him before unleashing Burner Finger 3 for the first time in the anime. Just like everything else in this episode, Burner Finger 3 looks pretty fantastic here. Bazz-B rams his fingers into the ground beneath him and it instantly bubbles, transforming into a wave of lava from which a river, a torrent of fire, rushes towards Haschwalth. In a new sequence, Haschwalth counters the blast by holding his sword out, instead diverting the lava around him in a flaming ring. In this moment, Haschwalth's form is obfuscated by the flames, leaving only a flickering silhouette amongst the fire. This is of course a callback to Senjumaru's bankai, which depicted both herself and Haschwalth in the exact same way, proving that this destiny, this thread of fate, has caught up with the Grand Master. This callback to Senjumaru's bankai is very interesting to me. Think about it, so far the bankai has alluded to the defeats of each of the Schutzstaffel. Leal was blasted by his own gun, Pernida was devoured and died as a result of devouring Nemu, and we have a pretty good idea of what will happen to both Askin and Gerard in the future. And yet here, it feels like the episode is trying to tell us that this is the moment the fates of these two characters is sealed. This is the moment where Bazz-B perhaps could have won on some other thread of fate, but in this lifetime, Haschwalth overcomes it. He overcomes the fate laid out for him by Senjumaru's bankai, unlike his comrades. But with Haschwalth seemingly pinned, Bazz-B conjures his crossbow and prepares to fire, the rippling flames reflected in their eyes. At this point, the episode returns to the past, as a young Bazz kneels upon the earth, his family's castle engulfed by a powerful blue flame, in another wonderfully evocative image. In the manga, all we get is a fleeting glimpse of Yhwach himself, as it's revealed he was responsible for torching the castle to the ground, but the anime goes so much further. In a flashback within a flashback, the anime actually shows us the brutal sacking of Bazz's family castle, as Yhwach and his men ruthlessly butcher the entire Black clan. This is such a cool sequence, as we get to see the original Schutzstaffel in action briefly as they massacre soldiers in droves, quite literally gunning them down in some instances. Also, without context, this sounds absolutely wild, I've just realised. Hubert dashes about, carving up the men with his sabre, while Argola, whose weapon of choice I don't think had ever been revealed until this point, hacks away at his enemies with a pair of hand axes. Meanwhile, Zeidritz, standing just in front of Yhwach himself, shoots various soldiers with a pair of pistols. Interestingly, despite his uniform already being shown in the manga, and being depicted as such later on, Zeidritz is given a completely new look while out in the field, decking him out in a green military jacket that seems to signify his high rank even among the Schutzstaffel. Finally, we cut over to the unnamed Quincy girl, who blasts unfortunate soldiers with her rifle. I've heard the name Nikita Deathlock thrown around a bit, but I don't think that's official. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it also doesn't seem to go remotely with the other soldiers' names either, though it is kind of cool in an edgy sort of way. Regardless, it's neat to see her again. She was introduced out of the blue in the new flashback found in episode 24, so it's a nice piece of anime-only continuity that she returns here. I don't really know what her deal is outside of just creating another badass Quincy character who happens to be a woman. I do like that, much like other Quincy gunmen, the muzzle flash of her rifle takes the shape of a Quincy cross. But Bazz-B and a woman, she could be his mother, but I'm more inclined to think she's more of a minder or some kind of a nanny almost. Watch the chaos unfolding from one of the towers. I feel like they possibly should have been using this time to escape out of the castle's back door, hidden exit, secret tunnel, whatever they've got, but there you go. In a moment of truly unexpected and frankly unadulterated brutality, the Quincy girl turns and casually snipes the woman through the window, her head exploding in a fountain of blood. Even though we didn't know this woman at all, it's a genuinely effective moment of unrelenting savagery and evil. By the way, where are those folks who were saying Yhwach's actually a nice guy with noble goals now? Yeah, there's a reason he was ranked number 3 on my list of the most evil Bleach characters. I love that the anime is again choosing to show and not tell, depicting Yhwach's cruel conquest of these lands as a genocidal warlord. What's interesting about this as well is that these are presumably fellow Quincy that Yhwach is murdering on a massive scale. But of course, Yhwach wants to reign supreme and force all Quincy to be reliant upon him in the future, so any family that holds any kind of prestige needs to fall in a very public and very bloody way. Also, the fact that the anime takes the time to detail the destruction of Bazz-B's family again in a very violent manner only serves to make Haschwalth look even worse, in my opinion, for choosing to side with Yhwach in the end, despite knowing exactly what he inflicted upon Bazz-B's family. Another point that might be completely unrelated is that it feels like there's a grim correlation between this woman's head being blown off before Bazz-B's very eyes and the way Bazz-B would later do the exact same thing to Riku in the first invasion. Anyway, as if to completely and utterly finish the job, Yhwach himself effortlessly conjures a colossal Zankt Borgen in the sky above the castle. And this really is a phenomenal image. The giant glittering Quincy bow hovering amongst the Aurora Borealis like something descending from heaven itself, yet of course it's a bringer of death. It looks godly, and it is, but it's a message to the rest of the region. If you see this bow above a castle or something like that, that family's reign is over. And Yhwach's strike devastates the castle in a shimmering aqua explosion, lighting up the surrounding forest in a flurry of starlight. Bazz-B and the now headless woman fall from a tower, with Baz landing on her body and softening the blow. As the castle collapses around him, Baz flees from the scene. Staring in horror, Baz watches as 4 horsemen emerge from the castle, a picture of the apocalypse themselves, having set the courtyard ablaze. It's another awesome shot. Watching Yhwach's original Schutzstaffel leaving such a trail of destruction behind is a powerful, potent image. With a pure, bristling hatred in his eyes, Bazz then watches from his hiding place as Yhwach himself rides on by, the almighty active in his eyes, meaning this sequence takes place before the Quincy King's fateful meeting with Ichibei prior to his invasion. And that makes a lot of sense. Ichibei doesn't really care that Yhwach is levelling castles to the ground. That is tiny as far as he's concerned. But when the Quincy King starts gearing up for a much bigger war, that's when the Soul Society finally takes notice. But flying the banner of the Licht Reich, Yhwach and his men disappear into the forest, burning it to the ground as they ride onwards. The following day, in another new scene for the anime, Bazz kneels amidst the charred remains of his family home. As he and Jugo begin to rummage through the wreckage for anything they can find, a voiceover from Bazz begins to explain the situation. Yhwach is a well-known warlord, a brutal despot who rules the unspecified northern territories using a strange power. Bazz claims to have heard a rumour that Yhwach is 200 years old, meaning that by the present day we can place Yhwach's age at approximately 1200. So even back here, during the height of his power, Yhwach was clearly much more than a mere human, capable of living way beyond the lifespan of an average man. Anyway, as Bazz discovers a drawer full of trinkets and heirlooms, the anime adds a very nice new revelation. In the middle of all the rubble and the death, Jugo finds a beautiful ornate sword lying on the ground, the very same sword he wields to this day. I certainly didn't go into this episode expecting to learn the origins of Haschwalth's blade, but there you go. I absolutely love that he found it within the ruin of Bazz's fallen homestead, adding yet another connection to the two, but also the imagery that Jugo gained something from the fall of Bazz-B's family is kind of haunting. That Jugo would in some sense rise from the ashes of Bazz's clan with something that symbolises a new dawn for this character. This is doubly interesting for the simple fact that this is clearly a totally new addition for the anime. In the manga, Jugo is seen wielding a sword in this same flashback, but it is just a generic longsword that doesn't bear any resemblance to his current day weapon. This is a fantastic, worthwhile change in my opinion. Bazz declares that they are going to kill Yhwach, again deciding what path Jugo should take without ever really consulting him. When Jugo reveals that his abusive uncle was killed in the forest fire started by Yhwach, that probably should have set off some alarm bells. But Bazz, single-minded as he is, doesn't seem to really pay attention to what the act might mean to someone like Jugo, who is at last free to live his life how he chooses without fear of his uncle's abuse. Or he would if he didn't find himself immediately attached to Bazz, moving from one person to the next without ever really knowing. Living on the road together, scavenging and surviving off the trinkets and coins they managed to salvage from Bazz's castle, the two of them make their way in the world, training constantly to one day bring Yhwach down. In a new scene again for the anime, they sit around a crackling fire as Jugo muses that he can't keep up with Bazz at all, still completely unable to even make a bow. However, Bazz reaffirms that this revenge is for the both of them, even though Jugo has never really laid claim to any reason to hate Yhwach. If anything, he's quietly grateful to him. But whether out of naivete or misplaced self-importance, Bazz likely thinks that because he's out for revenge, Jugo will feel the same way, and maybe Jugo did for a time. However, moving on, as we reach the end of chapter 631, we are privy to a brief meeting between Yhwach and, who I assume must be his right-hand man, Sternritter. By the way, more full names for characters were revealed alongside this episode that we didn't know previously. Yhwach's Schutzstaffel is made up of Johann Sternritter, Hubert Alexander Reich, and Argola Larau, which is pretty cool. Sternritter questions the need for a new combat unit, considering their Lichtreich Empire has already conquered the entire region. It's again kind of badass that Sternritter was able to openly question Yhwach's decisions, so I assume that Yhwach held him in somewhat high regard. But of course Yhwach cuts him off, revealing that their new target is in fact the Soul Society, the prelude to the devastating First Millennium Blood War that would bring about the downfall of everything Yhwach has been building. Aghast, Xidritz can't believe what he's hearing, but a determined Yhwach reveals his new combat unit will be called the Sternritter, ushering in a new era. In again another nice attention to detail, the table they are currently standing around is the same one Yhwach would later sit down to negotiate with Ichibei on. Firing up chapter 632 as the flashback presses on another 5 years, we see Bazz continue to grow in strength, even able to wield 2 Heilig Borgen at once. Jugo, however, hasn't shown any talent as a Quincy and is still completely unable to even conjure a bow. Again, these shots are genuinely beautiful, showcasing a brilliant array of vibrant colours and shadows. As Bazz watches Jugo continue to work diligently to improve himself, he can't help but think that his friend won't be of any good in his quest to kill Yhwach. Despite that, Bazz feels like he can't just leave Jugo behind, as though Jugo is still this helpless dead weight that Bazz is dragging along out of the goodness of his heart, when in reality, Jugo is training almost constantly. I like how the anime depicts this too. Throughout the brief training montage, Bazz is almost always shown either sitting down or relaxing in some form. With Yugo's persistence on full display, it actually makes a lot more sense here in the anime how he's capable of carving up Bazz-B in the present day with very little trouble whatsoever. One thing that's very interesting to me, that I've only really picked up on thanks to this episode, is that the way Bazz views their friendship feels very similar to how Yugo's twisted view on friendships and relationships would later develop. Here, Bazz is considering how their partnership, how their friendship might help or hinder his quest to kill Yhwach, as though it's purely transactional. Like he shouldn't hang around with Jugo if it isn't materially helping him achieve his goal. This is exactly the same flawed logic that Haschwalth later presents to Uryu, remarking that Yhwach is the one Uryu should associate himself with since he bestowed him power, not his friends. And so it shows that even in the present day, Haschwalth is still living a life that is dictated by those around him, Yhwach, and still some semblance of Bazz's own mentality. Anyway, in another scene taken straight from the manga, Bazz and Jugo head to a nearby village when they catch word that Yhwach's military police are on their way. Sure enough, the soldiers ride into town bearing the banner of the Licht, the enormous Y emblazoned upon a circle. It's cool to see that in the 5 years since Yhwach torched Bazz's family castle, he now completely dominates and controls this land, to the point where he has a military police who stroll into villages and proclaim his word to the masses. There, Hubert announces the formation of the new combat unit, the Sternritter. Argola presents a brand new flag, ramming it into the ground, this one bearing a very familiar 5-pointed emblem, one that will eventually be used for the Wandenreich itself. Again, I have to give Kubo a lot of credit for his frankly sublime design capabilities. Turning the Wandenreich emblem into a Y by simply removing a couple of the spokes is a genius touch, while also effortlessly showing both the devolution and later progression of both the organisation and the iconography. While only Hubert and Argola are present in the manga, both Xidritz and the unnamed girl have also ridden into town with them here in the anime, presenting a real show of force. Hubert decrees that the Sternritter has been formed to invade the Soul Society, and any noble Quincy wishing to fight can apply to join their ranks. I'm a little disappointed the anime removed Hubert's line where he tells the people that Yhwach believes the Soul Society will become a threat to them if left uncontrolled. I always loved the notion that Yhwach was parroting Yhwach's lies, spreading fear among the masses and misinformation that the Soul Society was their collective energy in order to rally them against them, and a danger that needed to be attacked first, in order to justify Yhwach's warmongering among the civilian population. However, seeing his opportunity, Bazz makes his move, asking Yhwach to permit them both to join the Sternritter. Yhwach leaves, barely glancing at Bazz as he notes that although the test will be held at a later date, he's certain they'd never accept a nobody like him anyway. And yet, not wanting to let this opportunity slip away, Bazz conjures his bow and blasts an arrow at the ground in front of Yhwach's horse, the animal rearing up in terror. As Bazz challenges the entire Schutzstaffel to a battle, I like that the unnamed girl readies her rifle in response. But Yhwach dismounts his horse, and with a wicked grin, he draws his sabre, preparing to teach Bazz a lesson. Despite Jugo's pleas, the hot-headed Bazz charges into battle against Yhwach, when suddenly a crushing force slams into the boy like a brick wall, bearing down on his entire body with an immense weight that almost immediately pushes him to the ground in subservience. Of course, first things first, it has to be said that it is really awesome to see that fabled Reiatsu effect again. It's actually cropped up twice now in this core, the first time with Aizen, after having not been used once in the 1000 Year Blood War anime, and it looks really good here, perfectly capturing the crippling power that totally overwhelms Bazz and every other person in the village. Anyway, with Bazz pressed to the ground by the thunderous spiritual pressure, Yhwach enters the scene, barely paying the slightest attention to those around him. Or should I say, beneath him. I love how the anime faithfully recreates certain manga panels, such as this one of Bazz's eye as he struggles to even look around. To be honest, it's extremely impressive and indicative of his strength even at this age that Bazz is capable of lifting his head even while under the impossible pressure of Yhwach's suffocating power. As the Quincy King notes that he's arrived to pick something up, he comes to a stop in front of a most unlikely figure. Jugo, who is standing perfectly upright, the two of them surrounded by a ring of people forcibly bowing their heads. At the end of chapter 632, Bazz watches in horror as Yhwach calls Jugo his other half. Following on from the episode keycards this week, Yhwach informs Jugo that he will be joining the Sternritter as his advisor, a revelation that causes a ripple throughout his existing officers, specifically Yhwach, who looks most displeased by the news. Faced with this shocking moment, Jugo freezes. He doesn't know what to do next. Despite believing the two of them have wanted this for years now, and have trained for this very moment, Jugo has no idea what to do. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. The most obvious is, as such a passive and impressionable individual, Jugo has become completely reliant on Bazz-B to lead the way, so much so that when faced with a life-altering event, Jugo completely panics and freezes. But there's also the fact that in reality, while Jugo may believe on a surface level that this quest belongs to him as well, of course it doesn't actually. And so without that innate desire, that resolve, that direction, Jugo doesn't actually know what's meant to come next. But as he looks to his friend for guidance, all he sees is raw jealousy burning in Bazz's eyes, a total disbelief that betrays Bazz's complete lack of faith in Jugo whatsoever. The truth becomes clear, and I can't help but wonder that if Bazz had reacted differently in this moment, would things have changed for the way Jugo turned out? While Bazz has always espoused this diplomatic idea that the two of them would work together to get close to Yhwach and eventually kill him, ultimately Bazz is the hero of his own story. It was never going to be Jugo. It was never meant to be Jugo. After all, Bazz was doing the poor sap a favour, wasn't he? Letting him hang around with a genius like him. But when the time came, when the chips were down, Bazz knew that fate would ultimately choose him in the end, because why on earth would it ever choose Jugo? In that way, Bazz has always been subconsciously putting Jugo down, making him smaller in his mind. He's barely a person to Bazz, really, more a pet that he lets follow him around like a lost little shadow. So you see, that's what makes the characterization here so special, and adds so much depth to both of them and their dynamic. I said earlier that Haschwalth isn't quite the saintly figure that some make him out to be, and that's true, but Bazz-B is no angel either. He's always seen Jugo in a particular way and nothing else, and it feels like as their eyes meet that Jugo finally understands this too. He can't fathom why Bazz-B wouldn't be happy for him if this quest truly was both of theirs to undertake, but it wasn't. And knowing this in a moment of true selflessness, Jugo's first instinct is to try to get Yhwach to choose Bazz instead. But this only angers Bazz further. The absolute last thing he wants above all else is for this, let's call him what he is, loser, in Bazz's eyes, to take pity on him. However, Yhwach steps forward and sets the record straight. Jugo is a special Quincy, one born every 200 years, the likes of which Bazz had heard legend of while growing up. Yhwach was born 200 years prior to the Friend arc, and now Jugo is next in line, a rare Quincy who can only give power. Turning to Bazz, Yhwach callously shuts him down, explaining that Bazz only became the genius he is today, thanks to Jugo's influence. By being around him, he transformed Bazz from a powerless nobody into a god. In this moment, Bazz's entire world comes crashing down. He isn't special at all. Jugo is. And you even see it in Jugo's face, an almost distant look of quiet pity as the power dynamic subtly shifts between the two of them right here. Both of their worlds have been turned upside down, but in the aftermath, Bazz has been left with nothing, left to pick up the pieces, while Jugo has been elevated to heaven itself, and it's evident on both of their faces. As Yhwach rests a hand on Jugo's head, the Quincy King tells the boy that he needs him by his side. And once again, just like when Bazz offered him a chance at worth when they first met, Jugo's eyes shimmer with emotion. Now that it's clear that Bazz never really valued Jugo or his contributions at all and always saw him as lesser, well, that was another dead end. However, as soon as Yhwach validates Jugo as a person, before Jugo really knows much about him at all, aside from the horrible crimes he's committed, the boy's world changes again, and just like that, he latches on. Roaring with a violent rage, Bazz attempts to make good on his mission and blasts an arrow at Yhwach, but not wanting to lose what he's suddenly gained, Jugo makes his choice. An irreversible choice that would forever drive a wedge between him and his best friend. Haschwalth darts forward and reaches out, catching Bazz's arrow in his gloved hand, saving Yhwach, though I doubt it would have done anything anyway, and immediately making his newfound loyalty known. And as we switch back to the present day, to a scene that imitates their shared history, Haschwalth dispels the flames, freeing himself of fate and prepares to sever their bond once and for all. You see, it's not just the fact that Jugo betrayed Bazz in this moment and turned his back on their friendship, it's the fact that after they met again 3 years later, Haschwalth just is a completely different person around him and doesn't treat him in the same way whatsoever. He has completely changed and left it all behind, seemingly on purpose. But I'm actually quite surprised as we reach the cliffhanger of chapter 633 that the anime cut this shot of Haschwalth slashing Bazz-B across the chest. It's a really powerful image, but perhaps it wouldn't have worked as well in motion. After being struck, the sheer force of Haschwalth's swing sends Bazz-B flying backwards through a wall. Even at this stage in their fight, after Bazz-B has sustained a serious injury, Haschwalth attempts to get him to stand down, to put an end to the battle before it goes too far. Bazz-B, blood gushing from his gut, attempts to rise, even conjuring Burner Finger 4, summoning an enormous flaming sword upon his outstretched hand. In response, Haschwalth suddenly snaps at him, even calling him by his full name Bazz-B Black, as if to try and reach out to him amidst the escalating madness. But there's no stopping this rampaging bull now. Bazz-B swings, slicing into a nearby pillar as Haschwalth leaps from their platform, disappearing from sight to the bottom of a nearby flight of stairs. As Bazz-B roars at Haschwalth, demanding to know why he's running, and if he's really that scared of losing to him, the episode transitions into the final flashback, as we see an all-powerful Reich on the cusp of war. Firing an arrow at Haschwalth, Bazz-B attempts to force him to retaliate, but the Sternritter captain brushes him off, denying him what he wants once again before leaving. Haschwalth is chastised by Yhwach, who insinuates that he doesn't have what it takes to be leader. Presumably, with Yhwach now being the lieutenant commander of the Schutzstaffel, Haschwalth's appearance effectively demoted him, or robbed him of any chance he thought he might have had at taking the top spot of the Sternritter before the organisation was finalised. However, in a moment I've always really liked, Yhwach says that he'll beat some manners into Bazz-B himself, noting that if no one's watching, even Yhwach himself won't find out. Before Yhwach can act, however, Haschwalth glances back at the lieutenant, threateningly telling him that he's watching. This is such a great and very telling little exchange. Despite the massive chasm that's opened up between them, and despite Bazz-B thinking the friend he once knew is gone forever, there is a part of Jugo that still remains. And even now he's going to do what he can to look out for Bazz-B, and defend him from those who would seek to prey on him. In that sense, he's almost acting like an unseen guardian in this new world the two of them find themselves in, and it's a genuinely great character moment. One that makes it all the more devastating that Haschwalth is the one to kill Bazz-B in the end. Or perhaps more accurately, it was always going to be that way. It couldn't be anyone else. As we see the gathered Licht, it's cool to see the Sternritter emblem is now being widely used in preparation for their incoming war with the Gotei 13. Interestingly, in this shot, the Sternritter emblem above the door is upside down. As Bazz-B stands among the ranks, he watches Haschwalth leading the Schutzstaffel members. I was definitely disappointed to not see a single cameo from an existing Sternritter, and this feels like it would have been a potentially good scene for it. Imagine, after the Schutzstaffel have walked on by, Kirge emerges to crack the whip on the new recruits. It also looks a little silly that Bazz-B is surrounded by a sea of totally generic soldiers while he sticks out like a sore thumb. Literally every single soldier is wearing a hat and what looks like the same uniform, for example, and they all have what you'd call typical hair colours, but then there's Bazz-B, who just looks totally different in most every way from everyone else. Maybe that's the point, but it comes across looking a bit odd. Back in the present day, Bazz-B leaps at Haschwalth from above in another really cool shot, his flaming sword billowing from his arm as he winds it back in preparation for a massive slash. We then get the shot from the opening of Bazz-B flying towards Haschwalth. However, unlike in the opening where they lock blades, things end very differently here. In an utterly visceral scene, Bazz-B attempts to bring his famed sword down upon Haschwalth, but the Grand Master carves through his friend's arm with ease, sending the flaming sword spiralling backwards out of control. The sword rips up the staircase before splitting another pillar in a flurry of embers. Unlike most people who lose their arms in Bleach, in a really impactful and human moment that you can feel, Bazz-B unleashes a blood-curdling scream, clutching at where his arm used to be, blood spraying from the wound. In perhaps the episode's most startlingly gorgeous scene, Bazz-B doesn't give up. Instead, he pulls his remaining arm back, the fingertips on his hand lighting up as he prepares to unleash his ultimate move. Every battle Bazz-B has fought so far has been leading to this. For a long time we wondered whether or not Bazz-B had an ability that used, well, all of his fingers, and here it is. Truly going for the kill now, Bazz-B unleashes burning full fingers, sending a twisting typhoon of fire towards Haschwalth, illuminating the entire battlefield. Honestly, despite burning full fingers looking incredible in its own right, it does feel downright quaint in comparison to some of the absurd powers we've seen recently. But in a stunning finale, Bazz-B's attack is suddenly halted, the flames extinguished, as Haschwalth emerges behind him, his sword outstretched. The two of them seem frozen in time for a moment, when a wave of crimson blood explodes from Bazz-B's chest, and he stumbles in place, his arm dropping to his side. Coughing up an enormous amount of blood, Bazz-B turns and staggers towards his friend, each agonizing step inching him closer to death as blood pools on the ground. As Bazz-B reaches Haschwalth, grabbing onto his jacket with his final ounce of strength, one thing becomes clear. Haschwalth wasn't avoiding a fight all these years because he feared losing to Bazz-B. No, he feared winning. As the last of Bazz-B's heat dies out, he finally admits that Haschwalth defeated him, the solitary wound sustained by Haschwalth in their fight forming a faint tear of blood upon his face. In a genuinely beautiful and moving final scene that I think was handled masterfully, Bazz-B, hunched over and barely conscious, remarks that things never quite go the way he wants, and yet he always thought that losing to Haschwalth would feel a lot worse than this. And as Haschwalth looks on in silence, Bazz-B crumples to the floor. Walking away from the scene, Haschwalth leaves the last of his humanity behind as he ascends the staircase to return to his master's side. There's definitely a slight stumble in his gait, as though what he was forced to do has genuinely thrown him off balance, even if only temporarily. As we reach the end of chapter 634, the dying Bazz-B lies on the ground as Haschwalth continues upwards, sheathing his sword and definitively putting an end to their conflict once and for all. It's a somber conclusion to a battle unlike any other in the arc. While the narrative paints the duo in an obviously tragic light, at the end of the day, Haschwalth has made his choice. He's spilled the blood of the first person to take him in order to help maintain his king's new world. At this point, Haschwalth feels too far gone, having carved out the last of his heart. I've made this point in the past, but I think there is an argument to be made that in the eyes of Bleach itself and Bleach's central themes, Haschwalth is one of the very worst, most despicable of villains. Of course, there are numerous factors at play here that helped make him who he is, and it is very nuanced. But one of the main prevailing themes of Bleach is friendship and the bonds that bring people together. Villains that outright flout those bonds in the past have been seen as the absolute worst of the worst. Of course, Tsukishima comes to mind. And Haschwalth is similar in the way he seems to purposefully scoff at those very themes. He turned his back on that ideal, willingly severing those utmost valued bonds once, and now doing so again in a much more final way. This comes to a head, of course, in his battle with Uryu. Ichigo and Uryu are an obvious parallel to Bazz-B and Haschwalth, and in Uryu, Haschwalth sees what he could have been had he made better choices. Had he honoured his friend rather than his tyrannical king. Was Bazz-B perfect? Absolutely not. But this is why Uryu's speech on friendship angers Haschwalth so much. It's as though Uryu is speaking to his own regrets, buried deep though they may be, and he unknowingly forces Haschwalth to reckon with those demons. But that's for another time. For now, the episode comes to an end with a very poignant title screen, as Friend appears, with End highlighted in a bloody red, bringing this conflict to a close. Fittingly, the poem for the next episode features Haschwalth, and it's the poem from Volume 70, which reads, "There is no pain as long as I keep my eyes on the balanced scale." It's again pretty straightforward. Haschwalth clearly regrets his decisions where Bazz-B is concerned, but he believes he can shut all of that out, including the agony that gnaws at him, so long as he keeps his gaze fixed upon the scale that supposedly guides him and the choices he makes in life. Again, we see Haschwalth willingly discarding the vestiges of his humanity to focus on his goal, or his king's goal at least, and leaving so much behind. In regards to Sternritter in Memoriam this week, well, it's a pretty big one, I think, as we say goodbye to Sternritter H the Heat, Bazz-B at long last. One of the longest serving and I'd say most popular of the Sternritter, certainly one of the best in terms of characterization, in terms of development, and I absolutely love his shrift as well. It is sad to see Bazz-B go. But he served his purpose and he gave us one of the absolute best episodes of the series to date, I think, a true work of art that showed the Sternritter in a completely different light, actually bringing some emotional depth to these characters. In terms of predictions for the upcoming episode 39, well, I'm not going to do any this time. For starters, this video's been going for ages already, but also crucially, I've already done predictions in 2 videos now for the upcoming finale, both of which you can check out on the channel, so make sure to go and do that now if you're interested. But that's it for the review, guys. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well today. Let me know down in the comments, what did you think of episode 38, Friend, and the battle between Bazz-B and Haschwalth? What did you think of the way the flashback was depicted, of the new scenes we got there? Were there some things you'd have liked to have seen in the flashback but didn't? And what did you think of their fight in the present day, including that incredible conclusion? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Once again, I hope that those of you who celebrated it had an amazing Christmas. Again, thank you for the well wishes. And I'm going to end this video, as we always do, by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate you so very much. If you also want to support me over on Patreon, you can do just that. At the $1 a month tier, you get your name in the credits of every video just like this. And at $2 or higher, you can enjoy every video of mine absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, thank you once again for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.